Chapter 11, Network Security. I like network security. I think it's an interesting topic in general. It's one of my areas of interest. I don't think the book does the topic justice, though they certainly cover a lot of stuff. It's just not particularly well put together, I think. So I'll try to make a little sense of that for you. Hopefully it'll make it a little bit more clear. But I've also got some other material that we'll kind of look at that may shed some insight into it. So, introduction, we'll talk about security threats and network controls. When we say threats, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Controls are just some, some type of countermeasure, some type of approach to try to address that threat, to mitigate the risk, reduce that risk, eliminate that risk, hopefully. We'll talk a little bit about risk assessment, ensuring business continuity. This was a question kind of geared towards the last comp. So if you have anybody that was taking comps, there was a question about business continuity on there. Specifically business continuity, disaster recovery planning, and emergency response planning. So, you may want to pay attention to that particular area in more detail. Intrusion prevention, and then the chapter finishes up talking about best practices. So, security has always been a major business concern. That's true and not true at the same time. There's a number of surveys that have come out since really the early 80s that essentially try to query business personnel, people that are in charge of organizations, key decision makers that are familiar with an organization's information systems, and they query what are the most important things to you in your organization as it relates to your computer and network infrastructure. And security is rarely in the top 10. It has been in the top 10 over the years on occasion, but rarely has that been the case. Really, in probably the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, it's about as high as it had gotten. Then we hit the financial crisis in 2008, right back down again. Why? It's about money. Security costs money, and a lot of times when it costs too much, we're willing to kind of forego security at that expense. There's really a couple of types of security that we tend to think about: physical security and then information security. The physical security is when we're talking about physical access to stuff. When you pick up and walk out with a laptop, or pick up a server. Versus information security, that's just access to our data. That's a little bit trickier because we can access that if it's online really from anywhere if we don't have the proper controls in place. So computers and the internet have really redefined the nature of information security because it really allows you to get at data from virtually anywhere. Laws and enforcement in cybercrime really had a difficult time catching up. Why? Law enforcement's not trained in technology. Their goal is to go after criminals. They're taught law enforcement. That's what they know. That's what they understand. So they kind of had to play catch up. Are they doing that? Absolutely. You certainly have sections of law enforcement that are very well trained, really know what they're doing really well. There's a guy that runs the forensics lab for the FBI in Dallas, and he'll tell you, that they do a really good job at getting data off of hard drives that people have really tried to destroy. They can do all kinds of stuff. So security's come a long way, but at the same time, we don't necessarily have all the laws in place. Even though we can show that somebody did something, we don't necessarily have all the laws in place to be able to prosecute them the way they should be. In fact, it's a relatively recent thing. At one point, you could break into systems all day long, and there was no law being violated. At this point, there are a lot of state and federal laws that if you break into a system that you can be prosecuted for. So don't do it, you'll go to jail. And I'll show you a video a little bit later of a pretty famous guy that did exactly that. Okay, so with this whole idea of security is important, part of the reason it becomes more and more important is because everybody has access to security tools or tools that can be used to break into systems. They're available on the internet for free. If you get a little bit of interest. A lot of these tools are automated, and there's an image later on in the presentation that shows you an automated attack tool that really kind of allows somebody to create their own attack, you know, and really customize it to do whatever it is you want to do. So it's pretty scary. You don't have to have a lot of knowledge to be able to do some of these attacks. Incidents are escalating at an increasing rate. A lot of organizations develop CERT teams. And CERT teams are just an emergency response team designed to respond to emergencies, computer emergencies specifically. So there's a CERT that's run by the U.S. government, Carnegie Mellon University. But organizations have their individual CERT teams as well in order to be able to respond to events as they pop up. Information security losses, who knows? Nobody really knows how much they are. They don't know because security issues can impact consumer confidence. If you're a public firm, you don't want to report that. Why? Your stock price is going to tank. So a lot of firms would rather handle it internally. They'd rather identify the problem, close the loophole, and eat the loss. Unfortunately, that's becoming more and more difficult for them to be able to do. And I say unfortunately, maybe it's fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it. You have states like California and other states that followed suit, where if there's certain pieces of data that are breached, they have to respond, regardless of how much money is lost, even if it's $0. That if they lose certain types of information and it's not encrypted, they have to report the breach. Things like your social security number, credit card numbers. If it's not an encrypted form and their system are breached, in California, you must report that to the California government. And like I said, other states have followed suit in some cases. Let's see. Organizations are vulnerable due to the dependency on computing and widely available internet access to its computers and networks. Businesses have this need in order to stay competitive to hook their systems up to the internet. Customers expect it. They expect to be able to log in and pay their bills. They expect to be able to do research on the products that they're interested in. They expect these whole range of services from these companies, but to be able to do that, these companies have to be able to connect their systems to the internet. So it becomes a trade-off: security versus services to their customers. So this leads us to three central tenets of security. Some people will refer to this as the CIA triangle: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality says that we're only going to share data with the people that it's intended for. Now, if it's a website, that's everybody, because we're providing that for everybody to have access to. We want that data to be available to everybody. But there's other files that we want to protect. We only want to have certain people, we only want to allow certain people to have access to a particular file. For that to be confidential, we have to protect it in some way, passwords or whatever. Integrity refers to the file that we're sharing or the data that we're sharing really is the data that we're sharing. In other words, if we send a file to a friend, that the file that we send is the actual file that's received, that it doesn't get changed or modified or deleted in transit. And then availability is that we have access to the file when we want to have access. You've heard of denial of service attacks or distributed denial of service attacks. If we encounter a denial of service attack, that means we've lost availability. We don't have that access to the file that we want access to. Everybody understand what a denial of service attack is? Does anybody not? Okay, so types of security threats. Well, before we actually get into types of security threats, how you classify these really depends on what textbook you're reading, the security expert that you're talking to. This is not a bad one, but it's it's the way they've chosen to do it. But you can look at types of security threats in terms of being a disruption, being a destruction of data, or being some type of disaster. We tend to want to, when we hear about security, we tend to want to glamorize it. We think of Hollywood and we think of the various movies that you might see. And the reality is that the vast majority of your security concerns are not necessarily hackers. A lot of times they're internal personnel, or they're natural disasters, or they're obsolescence. Hard drives are mechanical devices. They fail. It's just a fact of life. And those all create problems for an organization. So we have to be able to address those, each one of those threats appropriately. So disruption is a loss or reduction in a network service versus a destruction is losing files, hard drive crash, something like that. And then a disaster, we may lose an entire network segment. Maybe a tornado comes through, a flood, something like that. On the intrusion side, are really more purposeful type of a attack. Hackers gaining access to data files and resources, unauthorized access, things like that. This is another one we'll come back to after the PowerPoint. There's a research article, one of the research articles I sent to you guys, I think does a better job of talking about this. So they kind of throw that one up there, and again, we'll come back to that one in that article. So controls, they call them network controls. A lot of things that you'll read about will call them countermeasures. Some type of roadblock that you're going to throw up in the way of a threat. Something that you want to use to mitigate the risk that's generated by a threat. Ideally, you can stop a threat from occurring at all. That's the best case scenario. But the reality is there's a lot of threats you can't stop, so you want to mitigate it to a degree. You want to reduce the effectiveness of that threat. Types of controls, again, one of the articles we'll talk about talks about these probably a little bit better. The one I'd prefer actually lists 4, and they kind of list 4 here. Preventative, deterrent, which they kind of have in here as well, detective, and then remedy or recovery, if you will. So preventive controls are ones that are going to try to prevent something from happening and prevent a threat from happening in the first place. So how might we prevent somebody from accessing our computer? What's the obvious one? Password. That's the best one by far. Everybody knows how to use passwords. We can implement policies on our systems to be able to require a long password, to create one that's a certain sophistication. So passwords is a good way. Locked doors, fences, those are preventive measures that we can take to protect our systems. Deterrent effects, and again, they don't break that, or deterrent countermeasure, deterrent controls, which they don't break out into a separate category, but some people would, really represent more of a proactive approach. An approach to basically try to deter people from attacking a system in the first place. So, for example, if you have a history of prosecuting individuals that break into your systems, that creates a deterrent effect. So if they know you're going to come after them each and every time, that you're going to seek the maximum penalty under the law, that's going to tend to have a deterrent effect, and that's going to help hopefully prevent future attacks. Those don't work, or corrective controls don't work, if you don't have some type of detective control. If you don't know that your system's been breached, you don't know that you need to restore data. You don't know that you need to take corrective action. You don't know that about any of this stuff that's going on. So you have to have some type of detective controls. Those may be alarms that go off, when a password's typed in wrong so many times. Maybe when certain accounts are accessed. Maybe a manual review of the logs. Who's logging in at what time of the day, things like that. Reviewing videotapes. If you've got a server room, maybe you put up a camera and record access to that room. You periodically review who's going in and out of the server room. So those are some examples of some of the detective controls that an organization might have in place. And then lastly, corrective controls. How do you get back to where you were? You restore from a backup. You replace the equipment. It's a hard reality, but equipment, though it might be expensive, is relatively easy to do. It's preferable to lose physical equipment than it is to lose the data that's on the equipment. It's the data that's really important, especially if you're a larger organization that has thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands or millions of records. Securing the network. Securing the network requires personnel designated to become accountable for those controls. To develop those controls, ensure that those controls are operating effectively. Think about backing up your data. Who backs up their data? Okay, nobody backs up their data. That's good. Back up my phone data. Back up phone. Okay, I do that periodically. I don't back up my data either. I'm not very good about that. I do have a NAS device, though, that has 2 hard drives that are mirrored. So it helps protect me from physical hard drive failure, because the data is written to both drives at the same time. And then update or replace those controls when necessary. Those controls, if you're not testing them out periodically, like your backups, how do you test out a backup? You restore from backup. The last thing you want to do is find out that your backup's not working when you need to restore a file. You think your backup's working, you go to restore a file after a virus, and it's not there. Well, your backup's not doing you any good, because you're not checking how effective that control is working. And because threats are dynamic, they change, they're not always the same, we need to periodically review those controls. We need to adjust controls to be able to account for changing threats. So let's throw this model up here real quick. So here is a model that looks at an organization, and it looks at threats holistically, so that's probably not the best way to do it. But it does look at threats. It looks at countermeasures or controls, deterrence, prevention, detection, and remedies. And it looks at those and says that we implement these in order to try to protect our system, in order to try to have an effective information system security in place. But at the same time, these threats, we throw up these countermeasures to mitigate the risk generated by these threats. But these countermeasures result in a change in threats. In other words, threats change in order to respond to the countermeasures. So it's this kind of a symbiotic relationship between threats and countermeasures. They're dynamic. They're not going to stay static. They're going to change fairly regularly. Risk assessment. So, a key step in developing a secure network assigns the level of risk to various threats. In other words, not all threats are created equally. A computer virus is going to be a certain type of threat. A fire is going to be a certain type of threat. One is more likely than the other. Depends on the environment that you're in. Maybe a fire is a real risk. But most places are going to suffer a lot more viruses than they are fires. If you happen to be in a very high location, chances of a flood are probably pretty low. Is it a threat? Well, maybe. But the idea is that not all threats are created equal. So you can use what's referred to as a control spreadsheet in order to try to identify the various threats that you face and rank them in a way to properly look at the risk and identify the threats that you face. So it might look something like that. Various assets that you have listed over here, various threats that you face over here. And then you can start to identify the threats that you face and the assets that are at risk. The book, I think, gives you a completed version of this, kind of gives you a little bit better example, I believe. So those network assets. Identify the assets on the network. What are assets? What are some of our network assets? They're going to be things like data, customer records, things like that. Our inventory, our hardware, servers, network cabling, etc. So we're going to evaluate those assets based on their importance, prioritize those assets, and then place some type of a value on that asset. And that value is going to be determined by its replacement cost. A server is kind of expensive. You know, decent server, say $10,000. That's $10,000. What about the data that's on it? If we don't have a backup, that data may be priceless, depending on the type of data that we've got. The personnel time to replace the asset. Physically putting the hard drive, ordering the replacement server, installing the replacement server, installing the operating system, setting everything up, restoring from backup. All that takes time. So that's part of the value of it. And then the lost revenue due to the absence of the asset. If you're Amazon and your servers go down, you're not making money. So that time certainly costs you a lot of money. So some of the types of assets: hardware, circuits, network software, client software, organizational data, and mission-critical applications. Then we need to identify those threats. Remember, there's that symbiotic relationship between threats and countermeasures. We've talked about controls or countermeasures. Threats is the other side of that equation, so we need to identify the various threats. And a threat's any potential adverse occurrence that can harm or interrupt the systems using the network or cause a monetary loss to the organization. So if it's going to cost us money, if it's going to cost us a reputation, that's a threat. Then we want to rank threats according to their probability of occurrence and the likely cost if the threat occurs. In other words, not every threat's going to necessarily occur. So take the nature of business into account. For example, internet banking versus a restaurant. Probably not the same threat. I wish they had, rather than using a restaurant, I wish they had used the example of a hospital, your health records. Because they're both very important. Your banking records, your health records are both very important, but they're significantly different. Financial versus your personal privacy about your health records. So the things that you want to protect, in both cases, the need for protecting that information is very important, but the reasons for protecting it are significantly different. So the likelihood and cost of threats, they threw this up there. Threat of viruses is obviously very high. Why? Viruses are easy. They're everywhere. It's very easy to spread across the internet very quickly. Email, worms, etc. But we've gotten really fairly good at handling those with antivirus scanners and things like that. In a lot of cases, our ISPs help scan data for viruses, which helps to prevent a lot of viruses. Theft of equipment is not very likely, just because of the dollar value. It's likely to happen, but the dollar value associated with it is not very high. Internal hackers, again, you can kind of go through that whole thing. The average dollar loss per event from an external hacker, a lot higher. Why? External hackers tend to be professionals. We'll talk about that a little bit more here.
What's the zigzag?
In a little bit.
What is that supposed to
It's basically saying there's a big jump right here from 100,000 to 500,000. In other words, natural disasters don't happen very often, but when they do, they cost you a huge amount of money. So it's a jump in the scale right here. So the two big ones are fraud. As far as the average dollar loss, they don't occur all that often. Fraud occurs more, but when they occur, the dollar value is huge.
How is theft of equipment possible?
Say that again?
How is theft of equipment possible? Like people in the company steal things?
How these computers are still here, I have no idea. Yeah, people in the company steal things. I mean, these computers are not locked down. The cables are. Now, I'll bet you if you unplug the cables, an alarm goes off.
I don't think so.
Maybe not. At North Texas, they do.
You want to try?
No, I do not.
Come on, it would be fun. It really lasted us there.
Oh, no. Do that after I'm gone.
We'll say that was a lab.
It's a test.
Just to see the security.
North Texas, I know at least in the College of Business does. They have cables that when the cables are cut or removed without the alarm being turned off, it sets off an alarm at the police station. And because they have a police academy, police are there like that. So, let's see, common security threats. Virus infection is most likely event. It's going to happen. Again, like I said, just because it's so easy to create viruses, they spread so quickly and easily, it's going to happen. Intrusion, device failure is going to happen. Devices get old. You get power surges. Mechanical devices like hard drives are going to fail. So there's all types of threats that exist. Identify and document controls. Identify the existing controls and list them in a cell for each asset and threat. For each asset in the specific threat, describe each control that prevents, detects, and or corrects the threat. So, there you go. This is what I was talking about earlier. That kind of spells it all out. You list the controls down here, and that way you can address each asset versus each threat, and make sure that you've got something to address each one of those various threats. You may not have, for example, fire. Maybe you don't have to worry about your client database. You're going to take care of your client database is going to face these threats over here. You don't anticipate that your client database is going to have an issue with fire, flood, power loss, etc. Some of the controls. Every organization is going to be different. healthcare, restaurant, banks don't face the same threats. So your list of controls, your approach to addressing those threats is going to be different. A good place to start is some type of business continuity plan, a disaster recovery plan, an emergency response plan. How are you going to react to the various threats when they actually occur? As far as fires, fire suppression system in the server room. If you're in a low-lying area, you don't want to put your server room in the basement. Probably a bad idea. UPSs is really a very good idea on almost every network, regardless of size. Not just for your servers, but also for clients in a lot of cases. And you can go ahead and read through a lot of those others. Evaluating the network security. Well, a lot of times your network manager has that responsibility. Their job is to look at the network and to design a network and maintain and run a network in a secure fashion. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the best approach. Why? Because they kind of get this tunnel vision. It's their network and they see it from their perspective. Hackers tend to have a different mindset. Natural disasters, well, they kind of react the way they're going to react. So just having that one person to assess the effectiveness of your security is probably not the best approach. You can use a team of experts called the Delphi team that kind of brings various experts together to assess security. The best approach is really to use external auditors and have them evaluate your security. Why? Because that's their professional job, is to look for weaknesses in your security system. And they are looking at it really probably closer to a hacker's perspective from a corporate espionage perspective. And it's probably the best approach. Business continuity planning, make sure that the organization's data and applications will continue to operate. That's the continuity part. Continue to operate in the wake of some type of disaster. So if we have a fire, we have a hurricane that moves through, or a tornado, how do we keep the business running? That's what a business continuity plan is we want to still be able to continue to function even though part of our system goes down. That's what a business continuity plan is. There are parts to a business continuity plan. Business continuity plans are a very overarching type of plan. You have disaster recovery plans, which is part of the business continuity plan. You have the emergency response plan, which is part of the business continuity plan. The emergency response is what you initially do. How do you initially respond to that particular threat? What are the first steps that you're going to take? Versus disaster recovery is involved really on the back end of the disaster, of how do we restore operations back to the way they were before the disaster happened.
Can I just have 1 second? Okay,
Yeah.
so with you designing, and I'm thinking of our project, is it the company that has to deal with that, or is it the people who are networking that have to think of?
Well, I mean, think about this of your organization. If let's forget that you guys are designing the network for this company. From the company's perspective, they want to know, at a resort, let's say they're on a beach somewhere, that if a hurricane comes in, how are they going to get back and back up and running as quickly as possible? How are they going to continue to function as quickly as possible? That's what their biggest concern is. Now, if you're a smaller organization, and we'll talk about that here in just a little bit, if you're a smaller organization, you don't necessarily have the resources to be able to have, you're not going to have a hot site, you're not going to have all this extra data, you're tied to your physical location, and you're probably not going to have the expertise to be able to restore all your data and all those types of things that you might need to be done very quickly. So you, as a smaller organization, you're probably going to turn to whoever's designing your network to be able to develop that plan for you and say, okay, what do we need to do? And excuse me, then you'll put somebody in charge that when this disaster occurs, your emergency response kicks into play. That person is then responsible for notifying the key personnel of, hey, this disaster has struck. Your responsibility is to contact whoever does our backup stuff, whoever it is that does our network stuff, so they can come back out here, make sure our network's up and functioning as quickly as possible, restoring our data as quickly as possible so we can get back to functioning the way we were. identifying the key applications that need to be up and running for us to be able to continue to do business. So, like I said, as far as a small business, you don't necessarily have all that expertise. You're going to rely on the people that are developing your network to do that. If you do a good job, that's what they're going to do for you. If you don't, that's not a service that's provided. Hopefully, you would charge less for your services. A larger organization may do some of that stuff in-house. Even large organizations are going to outsource some of this stuff, especially when you start talking about hot sites. Hot sites are really, really, really expensive. So large organizations, in a lot of cases, won't even do that. They'll have cold sites and then have their data backed up, and they'll have agreements where they're leasing a cold site, and if a disaster strikes, they'll temporarily move the cold site. It just takes them a little bit longer to get up and running. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's see. So, specifics of a continuity plan: preventing disruption, destruction, and disaster, and all that comes with that. So, trying to prevent viruses from happening in the first place. This is the best thing you can do is prevent these things from happening in the first place. If you figure out a way to prevent hurricanes and tornadoes and things like that, you can make a lot of money in this business. But until then, we got to focus on things that we have a little bit more control over. At least as far as the prevention side of things. Preventing viruses, preventing denial of service attacks, theft, lock things down, things like that. Detecting them, obviously, if a hurricane's coming through, you're going to be able to detect that. But if you have something like a virus that strikes and you weren't able to prevent it, but it doesn't make itself obvious, if it's a type of virus that installs a keystroke logger, for example, how do you really know you've got it? If you didn't detect it, if you weren't able to prevent it, now you've got to detect it, because if you don't, it's going to sit there and log all your keystrokes. It doesn't matter that your password is encrypted as it's sent across the wire. It's capturing your keystrokes at the keyboard. So it's capturing everything that you type in. So you got to be able to detect at that point. And then you got to find some way to get back to where you were, so correcting that disruption. So computer viruses. Viruses spread when infected files are accessed. Email, worms, for example, spread by themselves without user intervention. Our approach is really to use antivirus software. Antivirus software is great as long as you keep it updated. They use virus definitions. If those virus definitions expire or they get older, you're really not protected for any of the viruses that have come out since that definition update. Unfortunately, because of the global environment that we're in, there are viruses that come out all the time. So, the further away you get from your last update, you really become more and more vulnerable. So it's really a good idea probably to have your antivirus software check for an update every day. It's good to have it scanned. So that's the real downside about letting your computer get a little bit older. The computer gets a little bit older, it starts to slow down, your antivirus scanner kicks in, starts scanning. What does everybody do? Turn off the scanner, I'll do it later. You can't do that. So either let the virus scanner run, have another computer, get a faster computer so that when it runs it's not slowing you down. Incoming email messages are the most common sources of viruses. Check attachments to emails. Use filtering programs to clean incoming email. Essentially, the idea is be smart about it. If you look at a file and it doesn't look right, be sure and first update your antivirus software. Save the file locally, scan the file, and then open it if it doesn't find anything. Is that going to protect you 100%? No. But it's a fairly safe approach to take. Preventing denial of service attacks. Really, routers anymore do a pretty good job of handling denial of service attacks. They look for key factors, key things that tend to go with a denial of service attack. So as a result, they do a pretty good job of once they detect that a denial of service attack is occurring, of shutting it down. But it is still effective in some respects, particularly when you start talking about a distributed denial of service attack. It's essentially the same thing. The only difference is the attack is being launched from multiple locations. It makes it much harder for a router to determine where the legitimate traffic is coming from versus the bad traffic is coming from. So distributed denial of service attacks are much more difficult to pick up and tend to be a lot more effective. So that can still be a problem. There are some steps that can be taken. Have a lot of servers around the world. So rather than actually being able to prevent a distributed denial of service attack, one way to mitigate that risk is, instead of having a single target for a denial of service attack to be launched against, have multiple targets. That makes it harder on somebody trying to attack your site. Use intrusion detection systems, and if you're large enough, you can get your ISPs to do some of the work for you and have them verify that all incoming messages have valid IP addresses, that they're coming from legitimate IP addresses. Traffic filtering, verify all incoming traffic source addresses for validity. The more you're going to do that, the more processing, more bandwidth you're going to need. Traffic limiting, that's another way of trying to limit denial of service, because that's what a denial of service attack is all about, is tying up so much of your bandwidth that you can't respond to legitimate requests. So if you limit the bandwidth that you provide to any one IP address, you're going to effectively be limiting the possibility of a denial of service attacks. That's where the distributed denial of service attack becomes more effective. And then traffic anomaly detectors perform analysis of the traffic to see what normal traffic looks like, and then excuse me, then block abnormal patterns. Just a second ago, we were talking about antivirus and the need for virus definitions. There's two approaches to that. There's the virus definition approach, then there's a heuristic approach. That's what this is describing right here. It basically says we're going to look at what our normal activity looks like. Then, when something out of the ordinary happens, we're going to assume there's some type of denial of service attack that's occurring, and we're going to start blocking traffic from the IP addresses that we think are causing that. Now, the downside to that is we live in a dynamic world. If you're a company, you're trying to acquire new business, hopefully you're getting traffic from new locations. So it becomes kind of a cat and mouse game of setting your thresholds just right so that you don't pick up too many abnormal things, but you do pick up the bad abnormal patterns that occur. Theft protection security plan must include an evaluation of ways to prevent equipment theft. I don't know how much is actually lost. They say about $1 billion lost each year to theft of computers and related equipment. Attractive goods secondhand market making these items valuable to steal. Anybody here at eBay? Okay. What do they call? There's a term that they have for phones that you can find on eBay that have been lost. Jailbroke? No, that's a different term. That's for Apple products. There's a specific term for cell phones that you can get on eBay that basically refers to phones that have been reported to the carrier as being lost. They've been lost, stolen, whatever, and it's a great market for those types of phones. Unfortunately, some of those are legal. A lot of them are not. So it can be a big business. But to your question about stealing stuff, yeah, it happens all the time. People grab monitors. People grab, if you don't lock your server room, somebody's going to walk out with a server equipment. So yeah, it absolutely happens. Device failure protection. This is kind of like the virus thing. It's not a case of when, it's not a case of if, it's a case of when. Device failure is absolutely going to happen. Hard drives are mechanical devices. They're going to fail. Things like power supplies have capacitors in them. Capacitors dry out over time. There's a lot of heat that's generated in a power supply. That's going to speed up that process. So power supplies are going to fail. So devices are going to fail. There's no two ways about that. So how do we go about trying to protect ourselves from those? Well, we can have some redundancy built in. We can have mirrored hard drives. We back up our hard drives. We can have dual power supplies. So there's a variety of different things that we can do to try to protect ourselves. Using UPSs helps in case we lose power. Fault-tolerant servers, where you have two servers that basically perform the same function. When one server fails, it kicks over to the second server, and that second server takes over the load. That gives us time to troubleshoot that initial server, fix it, bring it back up online, and now we're back to having redundant servers. Disk mirroring is something I'm a big advocate for. There's a variety. It's this one level of RAID. There's a variety of different levels of RAID. disk mirroring is the poorest in terms of performance. In other words, you don't get any benefits as far as speed, but it's the best as far as redundancy. You have an exact duplicate of your data. Whenever data is written to your hard drive, it's written to 2 hard drives simultaneously. So it does not protect you from things like viruses. Why? Because if you get a virus, it gets written to both hard drives at the same time. But if because it's a mechanical device, you know the hard drive is going to fail. That's what it's protecting you from, is that mechanical failure of a hard drive. Disk duplexing is something that's very similar. It's basically the same as disk mirroring. The difference is having redundant disk controllers. So it's just taking an additional step. With disk mirroring, you have one disk controller that writes to both hard disks at the same time. So this is just adding a little bit more redundancy. There's not really much difference between the two. You can also have redundant circuits, routers, etc. How much redundancy can you afford? If you're mission critical, if you're eBay, or if you're Amazon, your livelihood rests on your connectivity. This becomes very important and becomes worth the expense. If you're a mom and pop store, this is way out of your price range. Any questions so far?
How much redundant, is there a level of redundancy to, like, if Amazon has like redundant servers or routers or something, you think they have only 2, or they can go even more than that?
Well, for somebody like Amazon, it's going to be a significantly different approach. Are they going to have redundancy? Yes, and it's going to be a lot more than 2. They're going to have servers that are spaced strategically throughout the world. The idea behind it is twofold. Not only is it redundancy in case of having a portion of the network going down, but having hard drive failure or an attack or something like that. But it also puts data closer to users. So if you have, say, a large hub in Asia, the servers over there are going to be able to respond more quickly to those in that particular region. So it gives them 2 benefits. It allows them to respond to their customers more quickly, but it also gives them that redundancy that's built in. You'll see a lot of large organizations that that's what they do. They have server farms located throughout the world, and it gives them that built-in redundancy and the ability to respond to customer requests quicker. So Yahoo, Microsoft, certainly eBay and Amazon would be the approach that they would take. Now, the downside to doing that is that it also requires a significant amount of replication. Replication refers to synchronizing your databases. So if you're storing data, if we got different data in those different locations, well, that's not really redundant. So that's a problem. So we have to replicate that data so that we have consistent data throughout our various locations throughout the world. That replication ties up additional bandwidth. So that's when you have to start to get into the ideas that we've been talking about as far as WANs and speeds and being able to optimize our WAN connections. So things like pushing replication times to maybe 2 in the morning, sometime where our network's not being utilized as much as at other times during the day. So that's where you start to get into some of those types of issues. Let's see, disaster protections. When the hurricane comes, pick up your whole business and move. Unfortunately, that's not always possible, but if you can, try to avoid the disaster in the first place. Decentralizing network resources, like what we were just talking about. Storing critical data in at least 2 separate locations in different parts of the country. This is something that really came to the forefront of a lot of people's minds in the September 11th attacks. It wasn't something that people really thought about. How far, what was the appropriate distance? Because some people were doing this. They were taking backups and they'd ship them across the country to a secure location. But we do business here. How do you get back, especially when all flights were grounded, how do you get the data back in a decent amount of time? You can't fly it back because all the flights were grounded. So really, this forced a lot of security experts to kind of rethink some of their thoughts on backing up data, where you locate it, things like that. And some security experts now will tell you probably about 40 to 60 miles away is really where you want it. Something that you can drive to in a reasonable amount of time, return to in a reasonable amount of time with backup tapes, backup hard drives, etc. So you want them far enough away that if a nuclear strike were to happen, that if a hurricane were to happen, that the chances are really pretty good that the two locations are far enough apart that one site might be affected significantly, that the other site probably less severely impacted. So that's kind of the idea behind that. Best solution, have a completely redundant network that duplicates every network component but in a different location. If you're Bill Gates, you can do that. If you're Apple, the most valuable company in the world, you can do that. But the reality is most companies can't do that. So they tend to go with a more scaled back approach. Cold sites, warm sites, a backup tape. It really depends on the organization. Other key steps depends on the type of disaster to be prevented. If you're in a floodplain, try to, don't put your server room in the basement. Don't put it on the ground floor. In fact, if you can get out of the floodplain, it's probably a good idea. As far as fires, if you're in an area that you run the risk of fire, there's various types of fire suppression systems that you can implement. Although you do want to tend to avoid water. Servers and water don't get along real well. DRPs, we talked about this already a little bit. This is disaster recovery plans is basically your way of trying to get back to where you were before the disaster struck in the first place. And that's the idea behind it. Usually it's going to involve backup media of some type. You've backed up your data. You need to restore it somehow. It may involve backup hardware devices as well. A DRP should include a documented and tested approach to recovery with formal testing. In other words, checking out the plan to make sure that it works. Restoring periodically from your backups to make sure you really are backing up data. That it's not just a backup routine that's running, but it's not really backing up the data that you're trying to back up. Plan for the loss of the main database or long outages of the data center. So elements of the DRP, names of decision-making managers in charge of the disaster recovery. In other words, who's coordinating these activities? Who is it that makes sure that somebody drives to the location to get that backup tape? Who is it that makes sure that you have a shell of a network up and running for that data to be restored to? So who are those people that are responsible for it? What are the various staff assignments? List of priorities of first fixes. What are the key critical components, the key applications, the key pieces of hardware that need to be back up and going in order for you to get back up and being able to collect money, being able to take care of business. Recovery procedures for data communications facilities, servers, application systems. And this is the hard part. There's so many contingencies. You can't plan for everything, right? So in some sense, this is a very generic type approach, but at the same time, if you haven't thought of it at all, you've got no approach. So it becomes one that's very necessary. Level 2 DRPs, 2 levels of DRPs. Level 1, build enough capacity and have enough spare equipment. Again, if you're Apple, that's great, but for most people, you're down here. Rely on professional disaster recovery firms. In other words, outsource it. Outsource it to somebody that's a professional at this, somebody that's done this for other companies, somebody that does this for a lot of companies. In a lot of cases, you'll have firms that will have fully operational data centers that they simply lease time to various companies. Unfortunately, you run into a situation where periodically you might have more than one firm that needs access to that site at the same time. How do you negotiate that? That's part of your agreement that you have to enter into with them. You have to have some kind of understanding of, do we get priority or do they get priority? What is the cost and benefit of that? So you might be able to get it cheaper, but you might have to wait for somebody else to get done with it first. Of those firms, they offer a range of services: secure storage for backups, which is always good; a complete network data center that clients can use in disasters; complete recovery of data in network within hours. The more features you want, as long as you got the money, you can get just about anything you want. Expensive, used by large organizations, but it may be worthwhile if it's critical enough. Any questions? Did you bring enough for everybody?
Probably.
That's a long chapter.
It is. I'm just kidding. Intrusion prevention. So types of intruders. Well, we got casual intruders. This is what you typically, I don't want to say that. Casual intruders, usually people that are just kind of playing around. They're not really intending to steal anything. They're not really intending to cause any damage. They're really just kind of, kicking the tires. What's available? What can they find? What can they see? They talk about script kiddies here. Script kiddies are nothing more than a casual hacker who has a little bit of knowledge. There's that expression, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. There's so many tools that are out there on the internet anymore for somebody that's just casually interested that they can do a lot of damage. They can get into a lot of places that they wouldn't be able to without that without significant knowledge before. So that's becoming a bigger and bigger issue. There's security experts. Those are typically hackers. Hackers is not a bad thing. Hackers is a good thing. The original idea behind a hacker was this was somebody that was interested in how things work. This was somebody that was interested in looking at something and applying it in a different way, trying to look at how something was originally designed and see if it could be applied to something else that the original designers hadn't thought of before.
But don't you think we're going around in circles? I mean, we have people who are trying to fix the problems, and then you have people who are creating the problems and posting it on the internet and telling everyone else how to create that problem.
Right, you've got those people, and they are enabling these script kiddies. And those
So
are,
it's just a cycle.
those are crackers.
Are we really winning anyway? How?
That's the problem. If you're a security expert and your task is to protect your systems, how do you know when you succeeded? You don't. You never know. You hope you know. You hope that you didn't lose those 10,000 customer credit cards. But if they did a really good job, they stole it and you never found out. You don't know that you were breached. That's the problem.
Sometimes I think, don't you think the people who design the security, they themselves put hard to crack it on the website so that they get more work?
As a matter of fact, I'll show you a video here in just a little bit of a hacker, a very famous hacker that went to prison. He was eventually caught. His name's Kevin Mitnick, and went to prison for a few years. Was not allowed to access any type of PC device for several years, and now he's a security expert, and people pay him to hack their systems now to test their security.
Yeah, even I follow some of the people who jailbreak Apple products, and the top 10 people who do that, Apple called them before launching a new iPad so that they try to hack him before they launch it so that they can drop those loopholes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there is one Indian guy who hacked into President Bush airplane security, and now he works as their security designer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it used to be a big deal where people would hack into things, and in a lot of cases, before you had the federal laws and state laws that were on the books, in a lot of cases what would happen is you'd have these firms that would say, we will not sue you civilly. So even though there wasn't a criminal law, you could still be sued civilly. We won't come after you civilly if you'll show us what you did. You show us how you broke into our system so we can fix it, and we won't prosecute. And that was kind of the cat and mouse game that was occurring for a long time. Then you had federal and state laws that passed it that said now it's a federal crime to intentionally break the authentication of a system, and so now you can actually go to jail. Now it adds a whole new twist to the whole relationship between hackers and hacking. So that's this idea that there's a distinction, and I want to make that clear, this distinction between hackers versus crackers, because hackers take offense to being lumped in with crackers. Hollywood just has this one category of hackers. That's what you always hear about. They're the bad guys that are breaking in and trying to steal things. Like I was saying, they really are just trying to figure out how things work. Are they violating the law? Yes, they are. So that's a problem. Crackers are the ones that are really trying to do damage, though. They're intentionally trying to steal things. They're intentionally trying to break things. Those are the ones that you really need to be afraid of. And unfortunately, that's a growing part of the community, because you see foreign governments that are engaging in those types of activities. They're sponsoring those types of activities. You see organized crime sponsoring those types of activities. So there's a lot of money now all of a sudden behind these attempts. A lot of money means a lot more expertise, a lot more assets to be able to launch attacks. So that becomes a big issue. Another possible issue is employees. Employees are a really tough one because they already have physical access to the organization. So they get used to your procedures, your policies, and as a result, it's much harder to guard against internal employees. Let's see. As far as intrusion prevention, requires a proactive approach that includes routinely testing security systems. The best rule for high security: do not keep extremely sensitive data online. In other words, the best security you can have is to leave your computer turned off, take out your hard drive, smash it, destroy it into a million pieces. That's a pretty secure hard drive. But it's not of much use. So, again, it goes back to that business need, that balance. We've got to put it online because that's what our customers demand. But, so how do we protect it? So if it's something that's...
Do we back up before smashing it? Or
Pardon?
Do we back up before smashing it, or we don't?
If you back up, it's still, that backup's a security risk. In fact, that's part of the problem there, is a lot of firms do back up their data just like they're supposed to, but they don't encrypt their backups. So now even though all your data is backed up, you gave it to some schmuck that takes it off-site 60 miles on a backup tape, stops at a hotel overnight, leaves it in the back seat of his car, and somebody steals his computer along with the backup tapes. It's all unencrypted, all your data's gone. It's happened. So that's the best security, is to not have it online, but it's not particularly realistic in a lot of cases. Something that's really important that tends to get overlooked a lot is the idea of a security policy. And a security policy is really something that is, because threats are dynamic, because we change our various countermeasures to address those threats that are always changing, our security policy needs to be a living, breathing document as well. Something that adjusts periodically to address the changes in threats and countermeasures. We need to periodically test it, go through those various policies, address those various parts of a computer security policy. We need to effectively communicate those with the employees. Employees, most of the time, want to comply with those policies. What usually happens, they get handed a book when they first start employment, it gets put in a drawer, they've signed off on some sheet that they didn't even read, and that's the end of it. The reality is you need to periodically quiz them, you need to periodically re-educate them, remind them of why it's important to keep their password secure, to not write it down on a post-it note. So elements of a security policy: name of decision-making managers, incident reporting system. If an incident pops up, how are they supposed to respond? I know I should report somebody that does something that picks up a computer and walks off with it. Who do I do that to? Where do I find that number? Risk assessment with priorities, controls, etc. An acceptable use policy. Everybody read the acceptable use policy when they log into their computer? No. There is one, though. Violate it and see what happens. User training on a plan on security and testing and updating plans. Securing the network perimeter. That's a difficult one. Why? Especially for a larger organization. Why? Because the perimeter is so huge. It becomes very, very difficult to manage. Much easier in a medium-sized company or a smaller company to be able to protect the perimeter. Basic access points into the network is what they're talking about when they say the perimeter. So the smaller you are, you're not going to have a lot of those access points. Basic elements in preventing access: firewalls, network address translation, physical security, and dial-in security. So firewalls come to us from this idea within a building of something that we implement to be able to protect one part of the building from another part of the building if a fire were to break out. That's what this is about. We've got the internal part of the network versus the external part of the network. The external part is bad. We want to keep the bad stuff out, so we throw up a firewall to keep the bad stuff out. Unfortunately, there's we tend to put so many holes in the firewall that they really aren't of a lot of use anymore. There's a security expert by the name of Bruce Schneier who basically says firewalls are junk. That because we insist on putting a hole in it for opening up ports for email, opening up ports for websites, opening up ports for all the various services that we want to throw on servers, that by the time we put so many holes in the firewall's not really doing what it's supposed to do anymore. Personally, I think you can't go wrong with a firewall. Maybe it's not quite as effective after you put all the holes in it, but a little bit of security is better than no security. So that's just one more piece of security. Something else the book doesn't talk about is the idea of defense in depth. This is one piece to your defense. Antivirus, backups, all those are pieces. The more pieces you have, it helps to protect you should something happen. So this is just one more piece. There's a variety of different types of firewalls. A couple of common ones are packet level level firewalls that filter out packets, and then application level firewalls that really give you a lot more control in terms of limiting the types of application traffic that goes across. So packet levels examines the source and destination address of every packet passing through. It wants to make sure that it makes sense. The traffic that's coming into the firewall, coming through the firewall, makes sense. Let's see. I'll come back to that one in just a second. The problem with it is this concept of IP spoofing. Everybody heard of spoofing? Spoofing is this concept that we want to lie about who we are. We're going to spoof the IP address and say we're really somebody else. Well, that's how you get around a packet level firewall. You basically say, I'm from an internal IP address. Even though I'm coming from the outside, I'm an internal IP address, therefore the firewall lets you through. Well, newer firewalls are getting much better about being able to handle that. They see an internal address coming from the external connection, the WAN connection, and it will drop the packet, at least in a lot of cases. Most firewalls do anymore. So firewalls are getting better. Another thing that we can implement are access control lists. We talked about those before on the wireless networks. It's a way to limit access to our system. We're only going to allow certain IP addresses access to our system, or we're only going to allow certain hardware addresses access to our system. All others we drop. So it's just an additional step that we can take. Application level firewalls act as an intermediate host computer between the outside clients and internal servers. Forces anyone to log into this firewall and allows access only to authorized applications. So we may say in application we're only going to allow HTTP access, or we're only going to allow FTP access, or SMTP, or whatever application layer protocol that we want. Another approach is we can use network address translation. Most home networks implement this. It's basically just taking internal IP addresses for your home network and basically masking them from the outside world. Your router receives an IP address that's public that somebody doing a port scan could ping that particular router and identify it, but they can't see what's on the other side of that router or what's on the inside of your network. So they don't know if you have 1 computer or 10 computers. They don't know the specific IP addresses of them. It takes them more work to be able to identify that, and that gives you a little bit additional protection. Proxy servers function essentially that way, doing the same thing. It's a subtle distinction. NAT is performed by proxy servers. But NAT can also be a separate thing that's provided by your router. A proxy server does more than just provide network address translation, though. A proxy server essentially says, I'm going to be an intermediary between the internal network and the external network. So when a request, somebody internally to the network says, I want to access Google, you type in www.google.com, it goes to the proxy server. The proxy server says, okay, you want to access Google. I'm going to strip your header information off of that request, and I'm going to put my information on that request and send it out to Google. And I'm going to retrieve that web page. And then I'm going to strip that response off header off and send it back to the requesting computer internally to the network. It helps to basically, if anything is going to be attacked, it's going to be that proxy server. So it helps to mask the internal side of the network, which is the network address translation part of that. Proxy servers do a little bit more than that too, though. Proxy servers also allow you to cache content. So you made that request to Google. Well, what happens when another computer on the network wants to access Google? It types in www.google.com again. It goes to the proxy server. The proxy server says, hey, wait a minute, I've already got that page. I don't have to go out to the internet and retrieve Google again. I'm going to send you my copy of the page. So you get a faster response. Your client is able to get to the Google page quicker that way. So that's one advantage to it. Now the downside is caching has pros and cons. It helps to reduce your WAN connection and improve speed. But what happens if you're accessing a page that changes a lot? That cached content isn't up to date. Now, Google's page, with the exception of their little graphics, don't change all that often. Essentially, it's a search function. It's pretty easy. But if you're going to MSN or something like that, where you've got a lot of content that's changing by the minute, cached pages are probably not as big of an advantage. We already talked about that. Physical security means preventing outsiders from gaining access into offices, server rooms, and equipment. Lock the doors, passwords, those types of things. So proper access controls to areas where network equipment is located. Only authorized personnel to access. Each network component to have its own level of physical security. Locks on power switches, passwords, all that kind of stuff. Only authorized personnel to access. I was talking about Kevin Mitnick earlier, and we'll watch a video here in just a second about him. He's written a few books, and the last one he wrote was really a biography about him called Ghost in the Wires. It's a really interesting book. He started out as a phone phreaker and all these types of things, and grew up just with this real interest in how the network, how the telephone networks worked, and was able to hack into various telephone switches and direct calls and to various places and all these types of things. He hacked the NSA at one point. He was hacking the FBI. At one point, when he was being pursued by the FBI, he had a system in place that he could identify when they were getting close. And he ended up leaving donuts in his refrigerator and left a note on the refrigerator that said, "These are FBI donuts." So, I mean, he's a very interesting guy. He's very intelligent. He's really good at what he did until he hacked into the wrong guy. He hacked into a security expert's computer and stole some stuff, and it ticked this guy off. And so this guy ended up helping the FBI to track him down. Took them a few years to do it, but they did finally get their guy. But his biggest asset, if you will, he's very knowledgeable, and certainly I don't want to give him a bad reputation as far as his technical skills, but his real skill was social engineering. It was this idea that authorized personnel is kind of a relative term. That if you walk into a facility looking right, if you walk into a facility with a badge that kind of looks right, you act like you know what you're doing, you've researched your target so you know the right names, you can get away with just about anything. When he was a kid, and I say a kid, he was in his late teens, he and a friend went into a place and just to kind of check it out. It was a telephone facility, and it was restricted access and all this type of stuff. And they were looking around. It was late at night. Security finally confronted him and his friend. And when they were confronted, they asked, "Where are your badges?" "Oh, they're out in the car." Well, the security guard wouldn't let them go. It's the right thing to do, right? You don't want to let the guys go. Well, he basically claimed that he was an employee, and he was showing his friend around, and he had done his research. He knew who some of the personnel were. So they went back to the security guy's office, and they called up this person in the middle of the night, saying, "Mr. Such and Such is here." Said that he's reviewing the facility. And so she said to put him on the phone. So he gets on the phone, and he starts talking. And he's saying stuff that you would normally say. Yeah, I'm just down here talking to, Bill came in, flew in, and he wanted to see the facilities before the meeting tomorrow. He's giving this big spiel, like he really knows what he's talking about. The guy, the security guard, is thinking, wow, this makes sense. He knows the boss, so everything's good. What he's doing is he's cupping the phone to his ear as much as he can, because the lady on the other end of the phone is saying, who is this? Who are you? I don't know who you are. When he's done with his conversation, his fake conversation, he hangs up the phone. The security guard expects to get the phone back saying everything's okay. Because he's hung up the phone, he figures, well, it seems a little fishy, but he doesn't really want to call back in the middle of the night to a boss. Everything seemed legitimate. He lets him go. 10 minutes later, when they finally get a call back from the boss, they realize they don't have any idea who this guy was. He's been gone for 10 minutes because he played the part. He acted like he knew what he was doing. He knew the right words. He knew the right names. So that's an example of social engineering. Social engineering will wipe out all your technical controls. If you don't have the proper training in place to say, no, I need to get verification from the person that was on the other end of the phone, you're not going to be any good. You're going to be in trouble. There's another case, and I don't want to take up too much time on that, but there's another case. Everybody heard of security tokens? Security token is an additional authentication approach where you basically have your username and password, and you have to enter the code that's on a security token that changes every 60 seconds. That's a really secure approach, isn't it? He managed to hack that too. So I'll tell you about that later if you're interested, or read the book. Personnel matters. Also important to provide proper security education. In other words, it's cheaper to find out before you hire the personnel that they're not a good hire than it is after you've already hired them and have to let them go. And that's just the reality. Securing network cables. If you've got open exposed cables, especially if you're using a Cat5 cable or I should say UTP or STP cable, it's relatively easy to splice into. So it's relatively easy to listen into the data that's going across that wire. Particularly when they talk about local cables. If you're a janitor for an organization, that's what it talks about. Employees. For example, become employed as a janitor and use various listening devices and computers to access the network. Well, if you're a janitor, you got keys to the vast majority of rooms. Well, what do you want to do? You want to put listening devices on network administrators, CEOs, CFOs, the key personnel. Well, you just do that behind because you're trying to find local cables because you know whose computers those cables are connected to. You go into the CEO's office. Attach a device to their particular computer on the back of their computer so that they can't see it. And you can sit there and listen into their data all day long. So you need to control access to those cables. There's other approaches to try to address those issues if that's important. You can use fiber optic. It's more difficult to splice into those cables. There's certain types of pressurized cables that you can use that set off an alarm if you end up piercing one of those cables. So there are techniques that you can take, but again, it depends on how valuable you expect the data to be. How much protection do you really want? Network devices need to be secured and locked in a wiring closet. LAN devices such as switches, bridges, routers, all those types of things like your network closet, it ought to be locked. Dial-in security. Routinely change your modem numbers. Use ANI, which, again, if you read that book, he'll tell you that it's not the most effective thing in the world, but it is a technique. Use dial-back numbers, again, not 100%, but it is an approach that basically says when you have a remote computer that wants access to your system, you dial in from a remote location, put in your login information, and then it hangs up and it calls you back. Now, what does that mean? That means you have to be at a location that's already in the system. So it becomes a bit of an issue. But it is another layer of protection. Server and client protection. You need to address things like security holes, operating systems, Trojan horses encryption. Why they threw this in exactly like this, I'm not sure. You could have done this a lot of different ways. But security holes, the software that we buy, that we download, that we install, is never perfect. There are too many lines of code. We're never going to have a perfect piece of software, unless it's about 5 lines, in which case you can't even spell your name with that. So we're going to have security holes in our various applications. So we have to take the time to diligently patch our system. When patches are released, we need to understand what they're being released for, what they're to address, and then install them as quickly as we can. Once discovered, knowledge about security holes travel all over the place. And in fact, most breaches that take advantage of security holes happen after they've been reported. Why? Because they get reported, then your virus scanners go out, or the virus creators go out and create viruses, create exploits to take advantage of those holes. They're not necessarily finding those holes on their own in the first place. They're reading the reports about the holes issued by the various vendors. So why is that so effective? Why does it work? Because people don't patch their systems as often as they should. Other security holes. Flawed policies adopted by vendors. New computers come with pre-installed user accounts. Windows is a bad one about that. At least it used to be. It's not as much anymore. But you have a lot of pre-installed accounts. Backup operators, for example. Various accounts that are pre-installed by default by the operating system. The more of those types of things that you have, that creates a bigger footprint, a bigger target for an attacker to come after. Operating systems themselves, I'm not really that interested in this one, but there is an idea that there are different classes, if you will, of operating systems, that some are more secure than others. It's very difficult to be a network operating system and be very secure. It is, because the intent of being networked is to share information, to share access to files, to share access to hardware. So it becomes a real difficult balancing act. Which one's more secure? The idea is that Linux is more secure. It's based on Unix. That's what most people would probably tell you. I'd say the reality is that probably neither one is more or less secure that much. Windows in particular recently has gotten much, much better. But having said that, you've got a lot of diehard people that are Linux fans, and they would certainly tell you that Linux is more secure. Apple is beginning to understand some of the issues that Microsoft has had for years and years and years. When you're the big vendor on the block, if you're going to write a virus, who do you want, and you want to have impact, are you going to write it for somebody that has 6% of the market? Or are you going to write it for somebody that has 90% of the market? Well, most people are going to write it for 90% of the market. Well, that's Microsoft. Who's 6? That's Apple. Actually, I'm not sure that Windows or that Microsoft is 90%. I don't know how much Linux has. But Apple is starting to see some of that now. As they have kind of rebounded over the last 10 years, they've become more and more popular. You're starting to see they're not quite as secure as what they were once seen as. And the reality is that their operating system is based on Unix. So that traditional rock-solid operating system has some issues. Let's see. Windows, part of Windows' Achilles heel was originally written for a single user, as a single user operating system, not as a network operating system. And in order to maintain that backward compatibility, the future iterations have not always necessarily been done with the best engineering in mind. The idea has been we need to maintain that backward compatibility. So certain sacrifices end up getting made to be able to maintain that compatibility. Linux, designed for multi-users from the very beginning with various access rights, and very few system administrators with full control. They refer to it as a root user. Trojan horse, not to beat a dead horse, so to speak, but nothing more than it's exactly what it sounds like. It's it's the Trojan horse looked like it was a gift. In reality, it's full of Greek soldiers. It's an application that looks like one thing, but in reality is something else. So you know those little cute games that your buddy sends you that, you know, you're doing this, you're doing that? Well, that's really cute, but what you don't realize is that there's also a keylogger that gets installed with it at the same time. So there's something else that's going on in the background that you don't necessarily see. And there's an example of a ready-made Trojan horse maker. What do you want it to do? You want to flash keyboard lights, you want to show the clock, you want to hide the clock, you want to open and close a CD on somebody randomly? Just make your own little Trojan. They say three types of Trojans. I don't know that I'd classify these as Trojans per se, but spyware, adware, and distributed denial of service. I don't know why they throw that in there either. Spyware, these are really more, I would classify these really more as malware. Malware is just a software with bad intents. Spyware specifically is trying to monitor what you're doing, capturing keystrokes, capturing the various places that you're visiting, things like that. Adware is targeted ad pop-ups. They're trying to get you to click on this and buy that. And you know, a lot of these places get paid for, you know, the more clicks that they get paid for advertising. So they just want you to click on this stuff. Really annoying. What's really kind of a pain is just it ties up your system resources. Your computer starts slowing down. It doesn't run as quickly as it should. And it gets really annoying quickly. How do we protect our stuff? How do we protect those backup tapes that we send off-site? How do we protect our data that's on our computer? How do we protect our data that's in transit, that's going from our computer to a server somewhere? We encrypt it, and there's a variety of different encryption techniques. Some of the basic terminology, there's plain text, and that's our base message, our unencrypted message, the original message that we're trying to send or get to once we've received it. There's the encryption algorithm, and that's a technique. There's open algorithms and there's closed algorithms, and current consensus is really that open encryption algorithms are the best approach. Why? Because you have mathematicians all around the world that are working on those types of issues. Now you look at a particular algorithm and they try to analyze it to see how effective it is. So if it's an open algorithm, various people can work on it. If it's closed, that means it's proprietary. A particular business owns it. And it's only as good as the engineers that work for that business are. Invariably, those perform much more poorly. They start out very strong, they're very good, but it's usually just a matter of time before some smart hacker / cracker ends up breaking that particular algorithm. The key part to it, so to speak, is the key. That's the unique number that goes into the algorithm that makes it secure. So the algorithm is open. The key is secret. You have to hide the key. And then there's the ciphertext itself. That's the jumbled up version of the text, of the plain text after the key's been applied through the algorithm. Decryption is the process in reverse of getting back to plain text. This is what we were talking about earlier, symmetric versus asymmetric. As it applies to encryption, it's the same concept. Symmetric, S for single, same key. You have the same exact key that you have for encryption and decryption. It's a very efficient approach. It's the most efficient approach as far as encrypting and decrypting. Unfortunately, it creates a couple of issues. It means you physically have to share a key. You've got to get a copy of your key to the person that you're trying to share it with. Well, how do you do that securely? You can't send it via email because email's not encrypted. You don't want to send it through public mail. I mean, it could get lost. So you have to figure out a way to get this key from point A to point B in a secure method. The other issue is if you want to share that key with a lot of people, or if you want to share that key with a lot of people, now all of a sudden anything you send that's encrypted to one person, anybody with that key can read. Or if you want individual encrypted messages, now you have a lot of keys you have to keep track of. So those are the real issues behind symmetric, but it's more efficient than asymmetric. So it does have its uses. It's just, in some cases it's limited, and I'll come back to that in just a second. Asymmetric, on the other hand, has two keys. It has one public key that you broadcast. You tell everybody, this is my key. If you want to send me something encrypted, use this key. And then you have your private key that you keep to yourself. You don't share it with anybody. You don't show anybody. The only message that this key will decrypt is one that's been encrypted with this key, the public key. The only message that this key will read is one that's been decrypted with it or encrypted with the private key. In other words, if somebody encrypts a message with your public key, they can't turn around and decrypt it with your public key. It doesn't work that way. So it works one way or it works the other. And that's a key part when we get down here to signatures. So, let's see. Yeah, well, I'll do this next and then I'll come back to this combination. So digital signatures. How does that work? Well, if somebody wants to, for a normal encrypted message, if somebody wants to send us an encrypted message, they look up our public key in a directory or on our website, wherever we want to plaster the world with our public key. So they look up our public key, they type up our message, they run it through the algorithm, and it gets sent to us. The only person that can decrypt it is us. The reverse of that works too. If we want to prove who we are, we encrypt a message with our private key. What's the only key that can decrypt it? The public key. Well, if somebody can decrypt our message, they know that the only other key that goes with that is the private key. Therefore, we're the only person that could have written that message. In a sense, we end up with a digital signature. We're the only person that can create that particular message because of that key combination. So that's how a digital signature works. In reality, because this one functions less, as far as a performance perspective, it doesn't work quite as well as symmetric. What we tend to see in some applications, such as e-commerce, is we see a combination of these two techniques used together. We see an asymmetric encryption event occur when we log into our bank, for example. We have that HTTPS that we see. What we have is we have an asymmetric encryption process that occurs in which we actually exchange a symmetric key. And then the rest of our communications occur using that symmetric key. Because this is an effective way of getting that key, that same key, that symmetric key, from one location to another. And then this one is more efficient, so we can, for the rest of the transmission, we use the symmetric key. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Okay. I know that encryption can get confusing, but regulation of encryption is considered a weapon by the U.S. government. As a result, there's a lot of restrictions on encryption. Those have been relaxed over the last several years, but the government's recognized that they need access to encrypted data. They need to be able to access systems that, say, for example, drug lords are encrypting. In some cases they have access, in some cases they don't. The NSA, I saw a video a few years ago where a guy that was running the NSA admitted that industry was catching up with the NSA. NSA used to be about 12 years ahead of where industry was in terms of technology, that they were able to, whatever industry was coming out with, that the NSA had already come out with things that could crack those systems. That 12-year advance had shrunk to about 4 years. That was a few years ago. I don't know where it's at today, but that becomes an issue for the government. We've already talked about encryption. User authentication, done to ensure that only the authorized users are permitted into the network and allowed specific sources or resources, right? So authentication goes hand in hand with authorization. But authorization is nothing if we can't authenticate somebody. What is authentication? That is knowing for sure that somebody who says they're somebody really is who they say they are. How do we do that? We talked about this earlier.
Username, password.
Username, password. Easy to implement. Everybody knows how to do it. That's by far the number one way. That's something we know. That's one way of looking at authentication. Another way is something we have. We might have a smart card with us, a token or something like that. Something we have. Another one is something we are. Retina scan, thumbprint, biometrics. Those make sense, right? biometric. No. What about the ones that measure your temperature, body temperature, sweat?
But that changes depending on your activity during the day.
Possible mission. Getting hold of. Carrie's pulling off the other part of this impossible mission. Getting hold of Grant's thumbprint.
Grant doesn't think we can covertly get a hold of his fingerprint. He gets really suspicious every time Jamie or Adam comes over here. So I'm going to have him copy a stack of CDs, and hopefully that way we can get a hold of his fingerprint. He's going to come to the store any minute. It's freaking me out.
Carrie's turned double agent to try to snare Grant's thumb, and a CD case may be the perfect foil. And bingo, he takes the bait.
Remember how you said we couldn't covertly get your fingerprint?
Easy as pie, but Grant's not amused.
Yes, I told the producer yesterday that it would be almost impossible to covertly get my fingerprint. Apparently, I was wrong.
Weren't expecting a double agent, were you?
Yeah, from our own team.
With the master print under wraps, Jamie successfully dusts it off. Look at that. Scans it in, and when he prints it onto acetate, he has one of those Heinemann moments of genius.
As you can see here, the prints that we were getting are all kind of jaggy looking. It's not real clean lines. So I realized that I can go back in this scale with a marker and clean up these jaggies, and then we can shrink it back down, and we'll retry our edge and see if that works.
It's a fine line, but with both Jamie and Grant's prints cleaned up, first impressions are that this might just work.
Dude, I think it's perfect.
With their hopes raised, it's back to the edge. But in case you're thinking of trying this at home, maybe we've edited out one crucial step. So, sorry, but you can't. Jamie?
Yeah.
You can find it on the internet.
Good.
I think they're really, really good. Jamie makes new gel prints, and then it's all ready to test. This time, the computer doesn't reject it straight away. It reads it some more, and then...
Access granted. Yay! We got it.
Yes?
Yes.
Dude!
You just made my day.
With access granted on the computer, it's time to access Grad's Superlock. But that's taking things to a whole new level.
Welcome, Jamie.
Hey!
Fantastic. That is awesome.
He just tasted success. Using a ballistics gel fingerprint, they beat the computer scanner.
Welcome, Jamie.
Hey!
That works.
So next up, it's Grant's fingerprint lock that has his thumb as the master. To rise to the challenge, Adam's getting hot under the collar. He's fetched the etch of Grant's covertly obtained print and has made a latex copy that he's going to plant straight onto his warm, sweaty, pulsing thumb.
Okay, so you guys ready?
Yeah, we've been working on this for days, and I think we have a couple things that might work.
Cool. Okay, well, I'll be here. All right.
You first. Okay. My pad did him a hard thumb.
But it's a bad start. Adam resets and tries again, but
This
nothing.
like body temperature.
With this technique dribbling towards busted, Adam tries licking the latex. And he's in. He has set off the next alarm, but the finger's been foiled.
I don't care about the alarm. It works, man.
No way.
That is latex glued to my thumb.
But they're not stopping there.
Well, that's one down. Shall we try all of our other techniques?
Next up, it's Jamie, who's made a regular ballistics gel print of Grant's thumb. And guess what?
Yay!
Hey! Nicely done!
Most people probably aren't going to go that extreme.
That's 2 for 2.
No.
At this point, the one we bought for the computer is a lot harder to break than this one.
Yeah.
Well, I say we move on to the copy paper now.
With everything they do working, the team goes for broke by trying the photocopy of Grant's print. No warmth and no pulse, just a licked piece of paper.
This is dumb. What is this?
Well, there's your problem.
So the myth that fingerprint locks can't be foiled is busted.
Oh, man.
So
Yeah,
that
it's It's just a photocopy. That's quite sad.
So that lock supposedly had never been broken. Supposedly assessed your body temperature, a few other things, which should have made it very difficult to crack. But as you can see, they did. Biometrics has a lot of promise in that it's one of those things that, as a user, you can't lose it, right? At least you hope you don't lose your finger or whatever. So in terms of reducing the burden on administrators, having to reset passwords all the time, stuff like that, there's a lot of promise when it comes to biometrics. But at the same time, they're not fail-safe.
The retina probably works better.
Probably better. There's probably a number of them that are quite a bit better. The geometry scanners, for example, that measure different points on your hand or different points on your face. But again, the point is they're not infallible. They do have their own bag of issues. The access cards and smart cards, something you have. The best thing to do is actually have a requirement where you need more than one kind. So have a password plus a token that you need. A password plus biometric, where you're combining them, what's referred to as multi-factor authentication.
Did they had that in the video? Password and a biometric?
They were just doing the thumbprints.
I think they were entering the password.
They were clearing it.
Oh.
That's what they were doing. That wasn't the full version. There's a full version where they explain much more about it. But they were just clearing the attempt when they were trying to get in. Okay. User profile, something else you can do in order to implement security. When they talk about user profiles in this sense, what they're saying is that a user has a certain profile. They're able to access certain machines, certain times of the day. They can't perform all the functions that they need to be able to do all the time. In other words, if you've got an employee that comes to work from 9 to 5 every day, they probably don't need access to the system at midnight. So you can lock the machine down, you can lock their profile down where they don't have access to the network in the middle of the night. That way, if their account does happen to be hacked, that profile doesn't have access to or authorization to access the system in the middle of the night. So even though they're compromised, the level of compromise is limited. So we already talked about something you know, something you have. As far as passwords, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more for just a second because I think it's a useful exercise. The biggest issue with respect to passwords is what we were just talking about. People have to have their passwords reset all the time. That creates an administrative burden for system administrators. So that's a real problem. But it's really not difficult to create a good password. So somebody give me a sentence with about 5 words, 5, 6 words. Any sentence. A sentence that's easy for you to remember. Maybe it's a poem. Maybe it's a line from a movie.
Blah, black sheep.
Blah, blah, black sheep. Okay. Well, how many words is that?
3. Blah, blah, black sheep. Have you any?
Let's say blah, blah. It's 2 words. Black sheep. Let's say it's 4 words. Well, the easiest thing to do is this is where the algorithm side of things comes into play. The easiest thing to do is take the first letter of each word. So in this case, we've got, let's assume those are lowercase, like a sentence would be. So that's 4. That's not probably enough letters, but we're going to take care of that here in just a second. So this is where the algorithm starts to come into play. The first letter of each word. Let's extend that algorithm a little more, make it a little bit more complicated. So let's do an uppercase, lowercase, lowercase. That's pretty good so far. Something else, we want to mix other types of characters in there. Well, S is a good one, or B is a good one. You could go capital B, lowercase b, capital B, $. Well, again, 4 letters is probably not enough. We want to extend that out. The easiest thing to do is, or at least another security tenet, is have a unique password for every website, for every account that you're accessing. So throw in the name of the website that you're accessing. Maybe you do all caps or all lowercase, or you continue the uppercase, lowercase, however you want to do it. So now you've got one for Facebook. You do the same thing for Chase, the same thing for Netflix. So it's a different password for each site. Now, you're supposed to increment by a number, or it's easy to increment by a number. Why? Because they make you change your password periodically, right? So you want to put a number in there somewhere. So
you could put the 00 as a 00.
You could. This is not where you want to put the number, though. Why? Because there's a lot of automated attack tools that when they go through various passwords, they'll tack on a number at the end and increment it because they assume that's what people are doing. So yeah, you probably don't want to put 00 there because again, this is going to be the name of each website. Chase, you won't have that 00 or 00 there. But you probably want to put this 1 instead of here. Stick it right here. And then the next time you have to change passwords, everything's exactly the same. Increment it one number. That way you've got a pattern for your number. It should be relatively easy. Blah, blah, black sheet. You can remember that. It's exactly the same for every site except for this portion of it, which is new, which is unique. And that's an easy way to create an easy to remember password that's difficult to crack. Is it perfect? No, it's not. Amazon had an issue here. They've since corrected it, but for a long time they were concatenating their passwords to the first 8 letters. So if you had, I'm just going to use this as an example. If you had password as your password, which is a bad one, and then, that's a pretty good password with all these extra characters, but when it gets concatenated, that's your password. So you could have a very difficult to guess password, but because they cut off the last few digits of your password, that's what's stored in their database. Now you have a very easy to remember password, or easy to guess password. So you can have, you can do all you want with having a really good password and still run into problems. But if you take an approach something like that, for the most part, you're going to tend to be better off. So everybody got that? That's easy little lesson.
I think you should give that class to toddler students.
Huh?
I think you should give that class to toddler students. I'm pretty sure a lot of people have passwords 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
They absolutely do. When I worked at a help desk at North Texas, I was helping out a professor, and he's too busy to do stuff, so he gives me his password, and it's his wife's name. Okay. So, Dr. Strutton's password is Bonnie. Forms of access, we already did that. Managing user access. Talking about authentication. Preventing social engineering. Breaking security by simply asking how. I mean, again, if this is what I was talking about, Mr. Mitnick, that if you act like you know what you're doing, if you ask, the idea behind social engineering is people are too nice. If you walk up to a door and somebody's walking behind you, what do? You hold the door open for them. Well, that's fine if you're here in the College of Business, but what if you're at a secure lab? Well, people's rudeness, you don't become more rude just because you work at a highly secure lab. You hold the door open for people. It's common courtesy. That's what we tend to do. But the reality is that creates a security risk, and social engineering takes advantage of a lot of those social norms that we tend to have.
What is that term called when you just allow people behind you? I know these just at the dorms they said you shouldn't let someone behind you. They should swipe. There's a term for that. What is that called? Do you know?
Tailgating.
Tailgating. That's it.
So attackers have good social skills. If there's one thing from, again, like I said, he's written 3 books. I read 2 of them. What I really took away from him was that he's a con man. And the only real distinction that I can discern from a con man versus a social engineer is a social engineer is really geared towards technology, really geared towards computing and breaking into technology systems. And the key component is this idea of social skills, this ability to be able to quickly think on your feet. and identify a situation and come up with the right answer at the right time. An example of social engineering is phishing. So sending an email to millions of users and trying to get somebody to look at that and say, yeah, that makes sense. I need to log in and give them my social security number. Something you need to do is classify users. Classify, and the book doesn't go into enough detail. You need to classify users and you need to classify data, information in your organization. You need to classify your information because you need to know what can be shared with the general public. You need to know what can be shared with most of the people in the organization. You need to know what needs to be reserved for just a few select people in that organization. So you need some type of data classification scheme in place. Once you've got that, now you can start to manage users and identify which of those users need to know what. Ideally, if you don't know, you need to restrict that user so that that user doesn't have access to data. If that job function requires that access, they're going to let you know. A user will never contact you and tell you, I have too much access to information, take some of it away. It doesn't happen. But if they don't have access to the information they need to do their job, they're going to contact you and let you know, and then you can check with their immediate boss and verify that yes, they have a legitimate business need for access to that data, and you can ease the restrictions based on that. But it's much better to start that way than the reverse of that, because users will not contact you and say, I've got too much information. Launch a well-publicized security campaign. People want to comply for the most part. They do. Keeping security in the forefront of their mind, that's the real issue. People get lazy. They write their passwords down. They don't think of some way of developing a secure password. It's not that they don't want to comply, but if you periodically remind them so that they are more actively thinking about it rather than passively thinking about it, they'll tend to comply much more often. Detecting unauthorized access, you can use the Intrusion Prevention system. A couple of different approaches, network-based versus host-based. Network-based intrusion prevention and intrusion detection systems are systems that normally have sensors throughout the network. A lot of times they'll connect directly to a router. They'll have sensors throughout the network so that they can pick up activity that's occurring on the network. Host-based are loaded on a specific machine. So they're not going to detect breaches in various parts of the network. They're only going to detect it on that particular machine. So it depends on the level of protection that you need as to which approach is the best. And then application-based intrusion protection systems, a special form of host-based IPSs, monitor just one application like a web server or an email server or something like that. Techniques used by ISPs, this is similar to what we were talking about earlier with respect to antivirus. You've got the misuse detection and anomaly detection. Misuse is based on a pattern, that essentially you've got a pattern of abuses that occur. As a result, you can download definitions that say these are the series of patterns that we can recognize. When the intrusion prevention system or intrusion detection system detects that pattern, it can respond appropriately. Versus anomaly detection requires some fine-tuning. Anomaly detection says we need to monitor the network or we need to monitor the host during a period of normal activity so that we know what normal is. Once we've got enough of a baseline to understand what normal activity is, we go ahead and set it to run, and then when anything outside of that happens, it says, hey, wait a minute, we've got a detection, and now we need to perform the function that we need to. Break off that connection, send alerts to administrators, things like that. Tends to be a little bit more dangerous, but because it can negate or can send off those alarms for legitimate traffic, but it is an approach. Intrusion recovery must have a clear plan to respond to breaches, steps to take once intrusion is detected, identify where the security breaches occurred and how it happened, use computer forensics area techniques. The reality is the steps to take once intrusion detected is really dependent upon the organization. Some, for example, want to maintain the connection. Why? Because they want to monitor what's going on. They want to see every step that an intruder is taking in an attempt to really identify what's going on, what they're coming after. Gives them a longer period of time to be able to identify where they're attacking from. That's one approach. Another approach is we want to break off that connection immediately. We don't care so much about catching them. We don't want to allow access to our data. We want to stop it as quickly as we can. The downside to that is it's going to be more difficult to find out who they are, where they're attacking from, things like that. One technique to identifying where people are attacking your organization from is through the use of honeypot, what's referred to as a honeypot. A honeypot is a system that intentionally is set up in order to entice people to attack it. It looks like it's a good target. It looks like an attractive target to somebody, and so they want to attack it. It's kind of a gray area as far as whether or not it's a good thing or it's a bad thing. If it's not done properly, it can be in a form of entrapment, where any information you get from that can't be used in a court of law. So that's problematic in and of itself. There's some ethical considerations. Is it really? I mean, you're enticing people to attack you? Is that a good thing? Are they really doing something wrong if you're enticing them to do it? So there's some mixed emotions as far as the use of honeypots, but they do exist and they are used. Best practice recommendations: start with clear disaster recovery plan and solid security policies. Train individuals on data recovery and social engineering. Teach people to slam the door in front of their peers. I mean, that's what you're supposed to do if it's a secure building. I'm kidding, of course, but you get the point. Use routinely antivirus software, firewalls, physical security, intrusion detection, and encryptions. Almost all organizations use some type of antivirus, and just the vast majority, almost 100%. I'm surprised there's that gap right there, especially with all the various free antivirus solutions that are out there. I'd be more concerned with keeping them updated. Almost everybody uses firewalls, VPNs, etc. Use a strong centralized desktop management. In other words, one of the real issues, if you don't manage your desktop computers very closely, you provide additional functionality to your users because they can install programs at will, and that's great for your users, but they also tend to install programs that they don't need or want or even realize they're installing. So to give them that ability, they have to have administrative rights, or at least close to administrative rights, on that particular machine, and that creates issues. So if you lock the machines down more, it's not as convenient for your users, but it will cause less problems in the long run. Use regular re-imaging of computers to prevent Trojans and viruses. Use deep freeze if you get the opportunity for it. Install the most recent security patches. Prohibit all external software downloads. Use continuous content filtering, scan all incoming packets, enforce vigorously all written security policies. You need to enforce them. There needs to be this certainty of sanction and severity of sanction that users are aware of. If you've got sanctions and you're not enforcing them, the users aren't going to pay any attention to them. If they're not severe enough, even though you enforce them, if they don't really mean anything, if there's no bite to them, if all you do is shake your finger at people, they're still going to violate them because there's no teeth to the policy. As far as management, security is the fastest growing area in networking. Networking and security and forensics is really, as far as in IT right now, is really the place to be. The database is pretty good and always has been. Cost of security expected to increase. More and sophisticated security tools to encounter ever-increasing attacks. Because of organized crime, because of foreign government participation, it's not going to change anytime soon. It's not. Will it someday? Yeah. It's just the nature of markets. But for the foreseeable future, it's a real hot area to be in. Expect tougher laws and better enforcement. It's tough to be able to address a lot of these issues through the legal system, but it is happening, and you see more and more governments cooperating with each other in order to be able to, in terms of extradition, in terms of intellectual property and things of that nature. So is law enforcement slow to catch on? Yes, but they are catching on. Security to become a major factor to consider in choosing software and equipment. More secure operating systems and more secure application software. So that's that chapter. It's a long chapter. I think it's a good chapter. It's interesting. So hopefully, when you go read it, you won't fall asleep. Couple more things. Let's see, we did that one. Let's do this one first. Kevin Mitnick.
Considered the world's most famous hacker. You're the most wanted man in computer crime, correct?
Yes.
Okay, you're a consultant now, but at one time you were, let's see, you bypassed the security systems of Motorola, Sun Microsystems, and Pacific Bell.
Yes, I did.
You served jail time for this. How much?
5 years.
5 years.
And a year in solitary confinement.
Why a year in solitary confinement? You don't look like a dangerous guy.
I'm very dangerous. No. The prosecutor had told the judge during a bail hearing that I could pick up the telephone and connect to NORAD and whistle the launch codes and launch a nuclear weapon. And because of this, the judge actually had a special order that I'd have to be held in prison without access to a telephone. So the only place they could put me was in solitary confinement. So I was there about that.
Could you do that? Because that would be badass. That would be badass. Now you've got a book about your experience. It's called Ghosts Through the Wires: My Adventures as the World's Most Wanted Hacker. How old were you when you started hacking?
But law enforcement didn't know that.
Did you get into hacking for the girls?
No. I should have.
Yeah.
But
why did you start?
well, I was fascinated with the telephone system. I started in a hobby called phone freaking, and I loved doing magic tricks and pulling pranks. I was a prankster by heart. And as the phone company became more computerized, I wanted to get access to phone company systems to pull pranks. And one of my favorite ones was to change the class of service of a friend's phone to a payphone, so whenever he or his parents tried to make a call, and say, please deposit 25 cents.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so what did you actually do that got you arrested?
Oh, I hacked into a lot of systems.
Can you talk about this? You seem hesitant to reveal the contents of your book.
No. It's all there.
It's all there.
But I hacked into a lot of systems, and I actually was a fugitive from the government for a number of years.
For 3 years.
For 3 years.
Yes.
And I was playing this cat and mouse game with the FBI, because I must have been a little bit crazy. And as they
Were you actually taunting them?
not taunting them, but I was watching them through the cellular phone system as I was able to work out their telephone numbers, and I hacked into the cell phone system so I can keep track of where they were. So if they got close to me, I would go farther away.
That's a good plan.
It's a really good
Plan. How did you finally get caught?
They actually went out with radio direction finding gear and tracked my cellular phone signal to an apartment in Raleigh, North Carolina on Valentine's Day, 1995. So I definitely wasn't hacking for the girls. I was alone behind my computer.
What do you think? If you did what you did today, I'm sure you would put solitary, but
Guantanamo Bay.
Guantanamo Bay, you think?
But probably. I mean, now that in this post 9/11 world, I think hacking is almost considered a form of terrorism.
But couldn't we use you, aren't you, weapon, because the Chinese hack our systems, right?
All the time.
Shouldn't we unleash you on our enemies?
Maybe that's a great idea. I could be the secret weapon of the United States and go after all those hackers that are breaking into RSA and...
But if you were our secret weapon, some other hacker out there could call you up and whistle into his phone and activate you.
I'll turn off my cell phone.
Did you miss the game?
Well, I actually hack all the time. tell everybody.
Well, how do you hack?
Well, just the other day I hacked into this, company's systems and got access to everything, but the only difference was they actually gave me permission ahead of time. They actually gave me a get out of jail free card so I could hack into their systems to find all the vulnerabilities so they could fix them before the real bad guys get in.
Is there a holy grail of hacking? Like something that like the greatest hacker would want to try to get into but no one's ever been able to do?
I think the holy grail back in my day was hacking into the National Security Agency. And when I was a juvenile, when I was 16 and a half, I actually was able to get into a telephone switch in Laurel, Maryland. And I was able to intercept an ongoing conversation from the NSA's facility in Fort Meade. I just popped on the conversation. I heard a man and a woman talking. And I go, ooh, this is cool, I could really do it. Then I disconnected and never did it again. Just to climb Mount Everest. I wanted to see if I could.
Is there any chance that you're just telling me that so you don't do Harvard jail time?
Possibly.
Thank you so much. The book is Ghost in the Wire. We'll be right back.
It's a very interesting book. He did steal lots of credit card numbers and things like that. He never used any of them. Literally, he stole source code for cell phones, different different operating systems, and never did anything with it. One of the interesting things about his case, one of his various arguments, was that the people that were really pushing the government to come after him were a lot of these manufacturers, the owners of these Motorola, for example, people who developed these operating systems, and they were saying that they'd cost us, however many hundreds of millions of dollars because he stole this operating system from us, which he never put out and published or anything like that. Didn't profit from it anyway. The caveat to that was these losses, supposed losses, were so huge. These are publicly traded companies. There are SEC rules that state that they have to publicly declare such losses so that the market can adjust accordingly. They never issued any of these public filings, so it was kind of a have your cake and eat it too from the government's perspective against Kevin Mitnick, that these companies were not declaring these losses because the reality was there was no physical loss of money. It's that gray area, if you will. It's an interesting case. If you do get a chance to read that book, it's really interesting. So back to that little model there. That's actually my model for my dissertation. So it's something that I think is kind of interesting. Something I wanted to also talk about was those two pieces of research, just briefly. If you haven't been to the library website lately, they implemented a button right over here called New Discovery. By far the best thing that they've done. If you click on that, it allows you to go to one place to search all of the various databases of the library. Books, periodicals, journal articles, everything, all from one place. And so, for example, in comps, when I ask for a paper by Straub and Welke, it's going to come back and come up with a few different articles. Let's see, I found this earlier. Right there. And so I already looked them up, and so here they are. This is the Straub and Welke one. And this one is, the idea behind this particular one is something that comes from the field of all things criminology. It's a concept called general deterrence theory. It comes from those four parts. Remember the textbook that we were talking about earlier? It only identified three. Well, here they identify four, and they call it the security action cycle here: deterrence, prevention, detection, and remedies. And it's the concepts that we were talking about in general from the textbook earlier. So it's this idea that through creating countermeasures along these lines, we're taking a systematic approach to implementing countermeasures in our organization. Well, we do a better job when we take a systematic approach because we tend to not overlook things. If we just kind of implement security in a hodgepodge fashion, we're going to overlook things. So if we take some type of a theoretically developed approach, we realize, okay, we need to apply various deterrent measures in order to protect our systems. We need to apply various preventive measures, various detective measures, etc., in order to protect our systems. We're going to tend to have a better set of countermeasures to protect our system from. So if you get a chance, read through something like that. This other one was by Locke et al. Back in '92. So they were identifying the sources of threats. And though the specific threats that they identified may not be relevant today because they do change, their classification scheme is relevant. They identified threats as originating from either internal sources or external sources. Internal sources, people like our employees, obviously, are an internal type of stress, of a threat. External, hackers. Could be, and those are just as far as human or non-human. Another type was human and non-human. Human and non-human. Human, again, employees. Non-human, maybe it's obsolescence. Our hard drive fails. We have a fire in the facility, something like that. Accidental versus intentional. Hopefully, if it's a fire, it's accidental, but maybe our human up here intentionally set a fire. So it's just a classification scheme to be able to look at the various threats that we face. And it gives us a way of trying to identify the relevant threats that our organization might face. Now, let me do one last one. What are some of the most recent threats and countermeasures? Threats, deliberate software attacks. Things like viruses, worms, etc. Technical hardware failures or errors. So our hardware failing. Acts of human error or failure. Employees type in the wrong things by mistake. That corrupts our database, so we end up with issues like that. And then things like natural disasters, something that's getting worse. It's moved up to 4 here. Back in 2004, Whitman identified that as being number 8. So that's something that's getting worse. If you look at deliberate software attacks, number one hadn't changed all that much. And so those are as far as threats. As far as countermeasures, the people that I was talking to actually identified password policy versus use of passwords. Anybody think of what the difference is?
Like the policy, you must change your password every month, and what characters to use.
Yeah, they identified passwords, a password policy, as being distinct of the password itself, that passwords are kind of accepted. We accept that as a normal form of authentication. What we don't do as good a job of is managing our password policy of saying, after 3 attempts, we're going to lock your account. Your password must be 8 characters long. It must have an uppercase, a lowercase, a number, or a special character. We don't do a good enough job doing that. And that's what they kind of identified. They also identified physical area security. That was something that was new to that list, both of those. Physical area security, things like securing the desktop on the desk so that people don't walk out with it. If somebody steals a computer that has important information on it, it doesn't really matter that you password protected that particular computer. Somebody removes that hard drive and puts it on another system, or they boot your system with a Linux boot disk, they can read the contents of your disk. So you can have some really good security. Once you lose physical access to it, a lot of the game's up. So that's kind of the idea behind some of the research and being able to find resources through the library. Please get used to that. You know, as undergrad students, some do a better job than others, but as grad students, you really should be very comfortable looking around the library website. It's not like you have to walk over there. I don't even know where there is because I access everything online. So, but you should absolutely be familiar with reading academic research and being able to interpret it. And in our particular field, in information systems, the academic research is much more readable than it is in, say, management or marketing or something like that. So, take a look at it. That was a long chapter. It was an interesting chapter. Any questions over anything, everything?